Half a second. That's all it took. On January 27th, 1984, inside the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles, 25-year-old Michael Jackson hit his mark on the sixth take of a Pepsi commercial, exactly where the director told him to stand. And half a second later, the pyrotechnics behind him fired early, sending a fireball directly into the back of his head, and for a few surreal seconds, before the crew even registered what was happening, the most famous head of hair on the planet was engulfed in flames while he kept dancing, unaware until the fire finally caught up with his nervous system, and the people around him swarmed in to beat it out. When the smoke cleared, there was a raw, circular wound burned straight into his scalp, and while nobody in that auditorium could have known it in the moment, that half-second accident would quietly become the hinge on which the rest of Michael Jackson's life turned. Because here's what makes this story almost unbearable in hindsight. This was supposed to be the greatest year of his entire existence. Just weeks earlier, Thriller had become the best-selling album in recorded history. An album that, by the end of 1983, had already sold 32 million copies worldwide, spun off 7 top 10 singles, and turned a former child star from Gary, Indiana, into a cultural force with, as one retrospective put it, greater significance than any African American in the history of the entertainment industry up to that point. He would sweep the Grammys that February with an unprecedented 8 wins in a single night. He had a chart-topping duet with Paul McCartney, a Guinness World Record, an actual place in the Smithsonian for his rhinestone glove. By any measure history had ever produced, Michael Jackson in early 1984 sat alone at a height of fame that essentially no human being had ever occupied. And it's precisely because of that impossible peak that the burning scalp in that auditorium matters so much. Because fame at that altitude doesn't simply reward a person and leave them to enjoy it in peace. It rewires the terms of everything that follows. And for Jackson, the accident became the first visible fracture in a foundation that the pressure of Thriller's success had already begun quietly destabilizing from underneath. To understand why that pressure was so uniquely dangerous for this particular man, you have to go back further to a childhood that was, by his own repeated description, never really allowed to happen. Jackson spent his earliest years being drilled, rehearsed, and disciplined inside the Jackson 5, performing under the direct and often physically harsh authority of his father, Joe Jackson, who Michael would later say practiced discipline on his children with a belt in his hand. There was no normal school, no neighborhood friendships, no unstructured hours to simply exist as a kid, because from the time he was old enough to carry a melody, his entire life had already been organized around performance. And by the time real solo stardom arrived with 1979's Off the Wall, an album that itself sold over 20 million copies, and announced him as a force independent of his brothers, Jackson was already, in a very real sense, a 21-year-old who had never actually been a child. That unresolved absence sat quietly underneath everything that came next, and it's the thread that connects almost every strange turn his life would take over the following 3 decades. Back to January 1984. The burns themselves were serious, second, and in places third degree, and because Jackson also lived with lupus, a condition that made his skin slow and stubborn about healing, what should have been a single course of treatment stretched into surgery after surgery after surgery. To manage the pain, doctors did what was medically standard for the time and prescribed him strong opioid painkillers, and for a while that's genuinely all this was. A legitimate medical response to a legitimate, well-documented injury. Jackson himself would later describe it exactly that way, saying the medication had initially been prescribed to soothe what he called excruciating pain following reconstructive surgery on his scalp. But here's where the story stops being simple. Jackson didn't stop working to heal. Only months after the fire, he launched straight into the grueling 16-month victory tour with his brothers, dancing through unhealed pain almost every single night. Medicated enough to physically get through the choreography, but never once given the actual time his body needed to recover. And that pattern, perform through it, medicate through it, never truly rest, would become the defining rhythm of the rest of his life. Doctors kept the prescriptions flowing long after the physical wounds had closed over, in part because the documented injury gave him a permanent, unquestionable medical justification, and in part because very few physicians in that era were willing to say no to the most famous man alive. It would be far too simple to draw a straight, single line from one burned scalp to everything that followed over the next 25 years, his childhood, his fame, and a medical system that repeatedly failed to protect him from himself all share responsibility. But it's undeniable that January afternoon marks the exact documented moment his body became chemically entangled with medication in a way it would never fully escape again. Alongside the addiction, the accident accelerated something else that had already been quietly forming, an obsession with his own appearance. The reconstructive surgery on his scalp gave Jackson his first real sustained exposure to what a scalpel could change about his body. And by the accounts of people who knew him well, something in him latched onto that possibility and never let go, chasing an image of himself he could never quite arrive at, no matter how many times he tried. Tabloids inflated the scale of it into pure fiction over the years, inventing procedures and numbers that almost certainly never happened. But even without the exaggeration, those closest to him described a man who struggled to look in mirrors, and who reportedly covered mirrors in his own hotel rooms, uncomfortable in his own reflection in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with something much sadder underneath it. This collided head-on with the enormous, almost impossible task facing him by 1985, following up the best-selling album in human history. Producer Quincy Jones would later say that all the turmoil building in Jackson's life made it feel like the right time for a very honest album, and Jackson himself, according to biographers, was privately nervous, questioning how anyone could possibly follow up something already treated as untouchable. He reportedly set his sights on an almost delusional target, 100 million copies sold, more than double what Thriller had done, and poured himself into the follow-up obsessively, delaying it twice, working simultaneously on music videos and Pepsi commercials, while preparing for a tour that had to begin the week the album dropped. During those years, 1985 and 1986, Jackson withdrew from public view almost entirely, and the vacuum his silence created was filled instead by increasingly strange headlines. A pet chimpanzee named Bubbles became a fixture at his side. A false rumor spread that he slept inside a hyperbaric oxygen chamber to slow aging, and reports began circulating about a visibly changing face, a fairer complexion, a sharper nose, a new cleft in his chin, changes that ignited public speculation he never fully addressed. When Bad finally arrived on August 31st, 1987, it was, by almost any objective commercial measure, a monster success. It debuted at number 1, stayed there 6 consecutive weeks, sold over 2 million copies in its first week alone, making it the fastest-selling album in American history at that moment. And it went on to produce a record 5 number 1 singles, something no album before or since has matched, eventually selling more than 35 million copies worldwide and becoming, to this day, one of the best-selling albums ever made. And yet, and this is the part that reveals just how brutal the trap Jackson had built for himself really was, significant portions of the American media openly labeled Bad a disappointment simply because it hadn't outsold Thriller, an album so freakishly, historically successful that comparing anything to it was, as one critic at the time put it, simply unfair. Spin magazine wrote bluntly that Jackson had gone, in record time, from being one of the most admired celebrities alive to one of the most absurd, and that the pressure to restore himself in the public eye was, in the magazine's own word, paralyzing him. Think about the psychological weight of that for a moment. A man had just produced the second best-selling album of all time, shattered chart records, and dominated radio for the better part of 2 years, and the dominant public narrative was still one of decline, of falling short, of failing to be as impossibly, unrepeatably huge as he had once been by accident. That is an almost impossible standard to live inside of, and Jackson increasingly didn't seem to be living well inside it at all. The years following Thriller had already been marred, according to people close to him, by strained family relationships, broken friendships with fellow celebrities, and a painful break from the Jehovah's Witness faith he'd been raised in. And now the bad era layered onto all of that a new, specifically physical scrutiny. The tabloids fixated obsessively on his changing face, treating his own body as a public spectacle to dissect, headline after headline, while the man underneath it grew quieter, stranger, and more distant from almost everyone around him. It was into this widening gap, a global icon on the outside, an increasingly isolated and medicated man on the inside, that Neverland Ranch was born. Jackson built the sprawling property in Santa Barbara County explicitly, in his own words, to give himself and invited children the kind of carefree, magical childhood he felt fame had permanently denied him. Amusement rides, a private zoo, movie theaters, an entire constructed world designed to let him, in some sense, finally live the part of his life that had been taken from him as a working child performer. For years, the public largely treated this as eccentric but essentially harmless, the quirky habit of an enormously wealthy man who had simply never grown out of wanting to be young. That framing collapsed permanently in August 1993, when allegations surfaced that Jackson had sexually abused a 13-year-old boy who had been a frequent guest at Neverland, allegations that detonated across global media in a way nothing in his career, not even the bad era backlash, had prepared him for. It matters to be precise here about exactly what the record shows, because the popular memory of this moment isn't always identical to the documented facts. A criminal investigation was opened. No criminal charges were ever filed. Investigators at the time cited inconsistencies in the accuser's account. In January 1994, Jackson reached a civil settlement with the boy's family, reportedly over $20 million, and the boy himself later declined to testify against Jackson in any criminal proceeding, meaning the underlying allegations were never actually tested in a courtroom, and no legal finding of guilt was ever reached against him. A settlement is not in itself an admission of guilt, and Jackson consistently maintained his innocence, but the accusation itself, whatever the truth behind it, permanently altered the entire remaining course of his life and public image in ways no legal outcome could undo. Stevie Wonder, who had known Jackson since their earliest days together at Motown, said something afterward that has stuck in nearly every serious account of this period since. Some people can handle things being said about them, and some people simply can't. And by every account, from people who actually knew him, Jackson belonged unmistakably to the second group. The pressure of the 1993 allegations landed directly on top of an already fragile decade-long dependency on painkillers, and that November, Jackson announced through a televised statement from Neverland itself that he was canceling the remainder of his Dangerous World Tour to enter treatment, describing the combined weight of the false allegations and the physical demands of performing as having left him, in his own words, physically and emotionally exhausted, admitting plainly that he had become increasingly dependent on medication, first prescribed to him nearly a decade earlier, in the direct aftermath of that Pepsi commercial fire. When he returned to the United States afterward, he was subjected to a strip search by investigators attempting to compare his body to a description given by his accuser, an experience so humiliating that, according to one report, he struck his own physician at one point during the procedure, barely making it through. 6 months later, in May 1994, he married Lisa Marie Presley, daughter of Elvis, in a union that stunned the public and generated immediate widespread skepticism about its authenticity. Presley herself, speaking to Rolling Stone years after their divorce, was remarkably candid about the complicated reality underneath the headlines, admitting she had genuinely wondered about his innocence at the time, saying plainly that the only two people who truly knew the truth were Jackson and the child, and that she could only ever go on what he personally told her. She described their relationship as genuine and physically real, while also confessing uncertainty about how much Jackson was capable of loving anyone at all, calling him a mind constantly at work, calculating, managing something beneath the surface that she never fully understood. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. Through the rest of the 90s, Jackson kept working, kept releasing music, kept performing at a scale few artists anywhere could match, but the shadow of 1993 never genuinely lifted. And in 2003, it returned with even greater and more devastating force. A new allegation emerged from a family named Arvizo, involving a young cancer patient who had also spent time at Neverland. And this time, unlike a decade earlier, prosecutors moved forward with full criminal charges, putting Jackson on trial for multiple counts, including child molestation and administering an intoxicating substance to a minor. The 2005 trial became one of the most exhaustively covered legal proceedings in American history. Cameras and journalists camped for months outside the Santa Barbara County Courthouse. Every detail of Jackson's finances, his medical history, his friendships, and his most private choices dissected in open court and broadcast to a global audience in real time. In June 2005, after a trial that consumed nearly the entire year, a jury acquitted Jackson on all 14 counts against him. He walked out of that courthouse a legally free man in every sense the law could offer, but the version of Michael Jackson who had existed before that trial simply no longer existed afterward. Neverland, the place he had built specifically to reconstruct the childhood fame had stolen from him, became permanently tainted in the public imagination, and Jackson never lived there again after the trial ended, eventually abandoning the property entirely. Within a handful of years, according to a court declaration later filed by the auction house hired to sell off pieces of the estate, the amusement rides sat rusting and frozen, the private zoo stood empty, and the buildings fell into visible disrepair. Are a literal physical monument to a dream that had curdled into something Jackson could no longer bear to be near. The financial toll of these years, largely hidden from public view in real time, was staggering. By 2005, Jackson was reported to be roughly $270 million in debt, an almost unthinkable figure for a man who had once been among the wealthiest entertainers on earth. The product of years of extravagant spending that never meaningfully slowed, even as his earning power and public standing both took direct, repeated hits. He spent portions of these years living abroad, in Bahrain and later Ireland, traveling with his 3 children, a man living something close to self-imposed exile, dependent on the support of wealthy patrons and old friends to sustain a lifestyle his once massive income could no longer comfortably cover on its own. Isolation deepened with every passing year, and the addiction that had first taken root more than 2 decades earlier, after a Pepsi commercial went wrong by half a second, never fully released its grip. As ordinary prescription painkillers grew less effective from years of continuous use, his medical reliance escalated toward increasingly serious solutions, eventually including propofol, a powerful hospital-grade anesthetic never intended for use outside carefully monitored surgical settings, administered to help him sleep through nights that had apparently become unbearable without it. In 2009, facing enormous financial pressure and hoping to finally rebuild both his fortune and his public reputation, Jackson announced a massive comeback, a 50-date concert residency in London titled This Is It. and threw himself into rehearsals with an intensity that friends and crew members later described as both remarkable and deeply concerning. He never made it to opening night. On June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson died at his rented Holmby Hills home at the age of 50, and investigators later confirmed the house was filled with a disturbing arsenal of powerful prescription medications, including OxyContin and Demerol, alongside the propofol ultimately identified as the direct cause of his death. His personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, was later tried and convicted of involuntary manslaughter for administering that fatal dose, a conviction that placed direct legal responsibility on the doctor rather than on Jackson himself, though the pattern that led inevitably to that bedroom, that anesthetic, and that morning in June had been quietly building for 25 uninterrupted years, tracing all the way back to a burning scalp on a soundstage and the very first prescription that followed it. In the years since his death, biographers and people who actually knew him have continued to debate how much weight any single moment deserves in explaining what ultimately happened to Michael Jackson, and it would be dishonest to claim the Pepsi accident alone destroyed him, when so many other forces, an unrecoverable childhood, a level of global fame that may simply have been unsurvivable for any human being, allegations that were never resolved with full legal clarity in either direction, and a medical system that kept saying yes when it should have said no, all played their own undeniable roles in the outcome. But there's a reason that January afternoon at the Shrine Auditorium keeps resurfacing in nearly every serious, honest account of his decline, because it marks the exact, documented moment his body first became dependent on medication. It would never fully escape, the moment his relationship with his own image first fractured under a surgeon's hands, and the moment the story of Michael Jackson quietly split into two separate, parallel timelines, the untouchable global icon the world kept watching from the outside, endlessly breaking records, endlessly reinventing entertainment itself, and the increasingly isolated, medicated, haunted man living through the exact same years from the inside, two versions of one person who spent the next 25 years drifting further and further apart from each other, until finally, in a rented Los Angeles bedroom on a June morning in 2009, there was no distance left between them at all.